Okay, so the first stuff here in output two, don't worry about that too much. That's more if we would need to run the code again. In fact, you can script down the descriptives here. I think I sent you in something else, but those should match up with what you see. Um, and then what we've done here is a set of medians tests. So this is like the two sample or independent samples test that we did in class, except it's for ordinal data. Now, this is a little tricky because we're doing this on the subscales, which you could argue are quantitative data, and you could also argue that the original data should never have been averaged if they're ordinal data. Um, so it's kind of tricky. This is a situation where you can't exactly win everything, so you have to kind of make your choice what you're going to go with. We can continue to talk about that. But for now, look at this as a non-parametric version of the two sample t-test. So we're looking across divisions. So are there differences on the average knowledge subscale score? And this subscale means this is where we've averaged all the knowledge items together. Are there difference between the divisions on the attitudes and difference between the divisions on behavior? And the initial results suggest that there probably is some evidence for differences everywhere. This would not be statistically significant, so the differences in median knowledge are not as strong, whereas the other two categories we're seeing a stronger difference. Um, Scroll down. I think this is a really nice visual here. Um, so it's like the box plots we did, except it's an ordinal version because, well, actually, I guess the box plots we did in class too were ordinal in the sense that they were at least, yeah, they worked with the median and the IQR. Um, so here we have the different divisions. And um, the grand median was the overall median on the knowledge subscales. So if you take 153 or however many there were and take the median of all the knowledge subscale averages, it should give you 4. And then here you see how the medians or the data played out in division. So like we said, knowledge, there wasn't a lot of significant difference. You can still see some tendencies towards lower levels of knowledge, for example, within emergency services, or maybe surgical services, maybe higher ones in the medical group. And we see a little bit more here. The reason we're seeing those significant differences is because of pairwise differences. So, for example, because the outpatient oncology attitude is consistently higher than the resource team's attitude, we know that there's at least some differences here in attitude. So the null hypothesis would be that all the medians are the same. Alternative is that there's at least some differences. And you can see that probably between outpatient oncology and resource team, maybe between radiology as well, or maybe between resource team and surgical services. Um, and then we see all the different pairwise. Like if you were going to compare, let's take one that we mentioned. So let's say we're going to compare resource team with outpatient oncology. We would resource team outpatient oncology. So you can see these values here. What do they mean? Um, the sig is our p-value. The adjusted sig, I think, is based on family-wide type 1 error. Yeah, Bonferroni correction. Good. So family-wide type 1 error. And what that's basically saying is if you're going to run all these tests and hope for a significant salt. Um, it's probably too much. That's why you're seeing all these ones here. Um, so it turns out that one uh, actually, let's just look for a significant one. Okay, so women's and children versus critical care. There we're seeing a difference. Women and children versus critical care. So here's the women and children, and here's the critical care. Um, and I guess the difference we're seeing there is maybe because you have so much higher sample sizes in those two. Um, I'm not sure exactly, but maybe that's why, even though they're overlapping, we're seeing a difference. If not, if that doesn't seem to line up with what you're thinking, another look at it. And sample average rank. I'm not even quite sure what it is. I could investigate if it's something you want me to do. Okay, and so here we have another one. This is for the behavior subscale. Um, Again, radiology is really low, but that may also be, there may only be a couple in radiology. So I'm not sure if you want to group any of these together so you don't have so many different divisions. That would be something to consider. At this point, I would say the pairwise comparisons aren't going to give you too much. I would go more by the visual and then start deciding whether you want to combine divisions there. So that gives you these. These are useful here. So knowledge subscale, we're seeing that maybe a little bit of a left skew. It seems that virtually everyone has at least a mediocre amount of knowledge, or that neutral amount of attitude. We have a pretty normal descent. Boy, it looks like someone's giving the finger there. Yeah, it's a fairly neutral, a little below low neutral on the attitude. And then behavior, and be careful here, the numbers are constantly changing. So do pay close attention to what these numbers are. So here again is our neutral. Most are neutral to above neutral in terms of here. And oh, okay, this is nice. This is what I was wondering before. So here would be the actual sample sizes. So women's and children does have quite a bit. That's why we were able to make more certain conclusions about statistical significance was because that sample size was so high. And yeah, that makes sense now why radiology was a very low sample size. So even though it was positioned, the entire box and whiskers was positioned lower than another one, it wasn't significantly different because of the standard error was so big there. So yeah, keeping this in mind, I'm wondering some of these, is there any way that they could be combined in a meaningful way? You don't want to just combine for the sake of combining. Uh, and this really gets more into the knowledge of what's going on here and what you're studying if you can lump some of these together. Okay, and then the final thing is correlations. So we have two sets of correlations here. The ones that say Pearson are quantitative correlations. These are parametric, basically. And this correlations table splits across. So this and this are all working together. It's just it was too big, so it put it into two different places. I can, in SPSS, I can produce all a single table for you if you want. Just let me know if you're more looking for the final area of your paper. So years of service is definitely a quantitative variable. The question is the other three, whether or not they are. Um, so by doing these subscales, you went from Likert type items to what's called a Likert scale. And I think I sent you a paper. It could easily be argued that a Likert scale is more like a quantitative variable. You can make that case easier. I I think there's still some question because it is coming from what are essentially ordinal data. Um, Again, my advice would be it depends what your purpose of this paper is. If you're getting it published somewhere, then look at what the journal accept. Do they accept Likert scale data to be treated as quantitative? If you're submitting it for Melody or someone's intentional approval, then you want to find out how they feel. It's a very controversial thing in statistical research. So I'd say the majority um, journals and people will allow it, but the people who are against it are very against it. But it's good to know who you're working with when you make this. In my mind, I would say, especially once we're dealing with subscales, that we could treat them as quantitative, and so we could look at the Pearson correlations. But just in case, I put these down here. These are Kendall's tau, so these would be non-parametric. And you do notice some difference. So if we look at years of service versus knowledge, the correlation coefficient there is 0.016. Kendall's and is negative, or sorry, 0.06 here. So a little bit different, but not too different. Um, and honestly, again, even these, the fact that you create the subscales in the first place means you took an average of ordinal variable. So even these wouldn't please a purist who demands that Likert scale data or Likert type data are never treated as quantitative. However, I think you can make a good case that the only thing you're sacrificing here is a little bit of precision. So if anything, the results you find would just be a little more on the conservative side. The true results might be even stronger than the ones you find. I think that's the argument you'd want to make if you decide to use these subscales as quantitative. So anyway, let's maybe take a peek here at the actual numbers. Um, I'm curious if that surprises you that, especially if we go up here to the Pearson, that years of service and knowledge are barely correlated. The more years of service doesn't seem to give much more knowledge, just a slight bit more knowledge about the mobilization factors. The attitude tends to, the more years of service they have, the more they tend to have a negative attitude towards mobilization. And um, the more years of service they have, it's basically no relation to what their behavior is. If anything, just a tiny bit negative, but that's so tiny that that would easily be accounted for random variation. So you'd basically say there's just not a strong relationship between years of service and behavior. And then you could look at the correlations between knowledge and behavior. For example, um, the more they know about mobilization, the more likely they are to have a negative attitude. It's kind of interesting. And I haven't double checked to make sure that you reverse coded correctly. If you want me to, I can. But maybe that lines up with what you were thinking too. It looks like the strongest one we're seeing is behavior and knowledge. So the more they have knowledge about what mobilization does, the more they tend to have positive behavior, or they actually um, take action about things. They might have a lower attitude, maybe because all that behavior requires time and energy. Uh, but in terms of getting things done and actually creating the behavior, it looks like knowledge. And I think you'd find similar relationships down here, maybe slightly different in how strong they are. So that's the correlations.